CHD 206. Today we are going to be focusing on mandatory reporting. You're going to watch the PowerPoint in its entirety, and then you will also complete an online assignment, which is the mandated reporter training, and you'll receive a certificate at the end that you will turn in as your midterm. We are going to go over what the Department of Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention does and how it came to be. But before we even get into all of those and what to do as a mandated reporter, I want to talk about the history of child protection. So in 1866, Henry Bergh, a philanthropist and diplomat who recognized the inhumane treatment suffered by many animals in our society, founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which we know as ASPCA. Prompted the New York State legislation to pass the country's first effective anti-cruelty to animals law, and the ASPCA is the oldest humane organization in America. 8 years later, a young girl was found tied to a bed like an animal, neglected, and brutally beaten by her foster parents. So back in 1874, animals were legally protected from inhumane treatment, but children weren't. So child abuse and neglect were considered a family matter, and there was no one to intervene on the behalf of children, until a small group of concerned citizens from New York City came together in 1875 with the assistance of this said man, Henry Bergh, to become the first organized child protective institutions in the world, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So let's meet the little girl who started it all. This is a picture right here of Mary Ellen McCormick Wilson when she was 10 years old. And we're going to meet Mary Ellen by the way of her testimony that she gave in a New York City courtroom in 1874. My name is Mary Ellen McCormick. I don't know how old I am. I have never had but one pair of shoes. I can't recollect when that was. I have no shoes or stockings this winter. I have never had on a particle of flannel. My bed at night is only a piece of carpet stretched on the floor underneath a window, and I sleep in my little undergarment with a quilt over me. I am never allowed to play with any children or have any company whatsoever. Mama has been in the habit of whispering and beating me almost every day. She used to whip me with a twisted whip, a rawhide. The whip always left black and blue marks on my body. I have now on my head 2 black and blue marks which were made by my mama with a whip, and a cut on the left side of my forehead which was made by a pair of scissors in Mama's hands. She struck me with the scissors and cut me. I have no recollection of ever having been kissed. I have never been kissed by Mama. I have never been taken on my Mama's lap or caressed or petted. I have never dared to speak to anybody because if I did, I would get whipped. Whenever Mama went out, I was locked in the bedroom. I have no recollection of ever being in the street in my life. After Mary Ellen told her story in court, her foster mother was prosecuted for assault and battery. Mary Ellen was placed into a new home in upstate New York and grew up a normal child. She became a favorite to all of those who knew her. At 24, she married and had 2 daughters of her own, and she also adopted a 3rd orphaned child. Her daughters reported that Mary Ellen was always reluctant to speak about her past, but she did show them the scars of burns on her arms and the scissors scar that were always noticeable on her face. It was her pride and joy to be able to provide her own daughters with a happy childhood in contrast to her own. And she died in 1956 at the age of 92. So that is the start of American society to confront its inherent moral obligation to protect its children, even from their parents. But reporting child abuse was not always required. Reports stem from only incidents which involve serious physical injury or death. So in the late 1950s, what happened in the family was regarded as a very private matter, and children were considered their parents to be their disciplinarian, and whatever a parent said went. Until in 1962, Dr. Henry Kemp described the battered child syndrome and urged physicians to report suspected child abuse. Eventually, many states responded to their perceived moral and legal responsibilities, making child abuse a criminal act during the late 1960s. However, reporting child abuse was still not legally required. Consensually, most incidents of suspected child abuse remained behind closed doors and were neither acknowledged or challenged. Finally, in 1974, the United States Congress enacted the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which provided federal funds dedicated to prevent child abuse. For states that passed laws requiring certain professionals, like law enforcement, educators, and medical and mental health professionals, to respond and report suspected child maltreatment. In short order, every state had a mandatory reporting law enacted from their own legislation. So that's a little bit of history behind child protection. And the history of Alabama's Department of Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention came in 1983 from the Children's Trust Fund, and that's the Children's First Trust Fund is the money that is set aside from the government to fund these types of programs, which are listed here. Within Houston County, we have a lot of these programs, and the money comes for prevention and to raise awareness within the communities. The core values are valuing children, strengthening families, and engaging communities. And the mission is to prevent the abuse and neglect of our nation's children. The Department of Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention has different areas of work: community-based prevention programs, public policy advocacy, public education, and a network of state chapters, all to help in the area of child abuse and neglect prevention. So what is a mandated reporter? Any person who brings themselves in contact with children on a daily basis is legally obligated to report signs of suspected child abuse or neglect. It's not if they are being abused or neglected, it's that suspected child abuse or neglect. And so here are a list of different areas that fall into that. And then we also have public and private K through 12 employees of public and private institutions of post-secondary and higher education, physical therapists, again, all of those people who come into contact with children on a daily basis. There are some changes that have been made to the mandatory reporting law, and this is the statement "or cause reports to be made of the same" has been eliminated from the law. It is the responsibility of the mandated reporter to make the report and follow up with a written report to the county DHR. Meaning, previously, I as a teacher was able to go to the school counselor or my supervisor, which was the principal, and tell her of a case, and then I just assumed that she would take care of it. Children were falling through the cracks this way. People were saying, oh, well, I reported, it's not my fault, somebody else didn't do their job. So now it is the job of the person who is making the initial report to actually fill out the paperwork to go along with it. But you do need to still let your supervisor know that you're doing a report, but that's not necessarily the first and last step. You want to make sure that we're covering the children. So child abuse is any kind of harm or threatened harm to a child's health or welfare which can occur through non-accidental physical or mental injury, sexual abuse, or attempted sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, or attempted sexual exploitation. Flip this over here. And we have different types of child abuse: physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect, which is failure to thrive. And we will go into each of these categories a little bit more in depth, but I did want to bring up that 1 in every 4 girls will be sexually abused by the age of 18. 1 in every 6 boys will be sexually abused by the age of 18. 1 in every 5 children in our country is affected by some form of child abuse, whether it's emotional, sexual, physical, or neglect. And 1 in every 10 children in our country is seriously injured by child abuse. With physical abuse, this is abuse that means harm or threatened harm to the health or welfare of a child through, like we have listed, non-accidental physical injury, sexual abuse, or attempted sexual abuse, and so on and so forth, as it's written down there. Children of all ages experience abuse and neglect, but the youngest children are the most vulnerable. Children younger than 1 year old account for 41% of the abuse-related deaths reported in 2002, and 3/4 of those killed were younger than 4. When we're looking at physical abuse, obviously bruises, unexplained marks, fear of adults, some aggression, Clothing might be inappropriate, like it might be very hot outside and children are wearing long sleeves to cover up their arms or their legs or whatever it might be. So those are some signs to look for. Girls are sexually abused 3 times more often than boys. And so that brings us into sexual abuse. We have 2 different types of sexual abuse. We have incest, which is going to be with a family member, and then we have sexual abuse that is from outside of the family. And then we have sexual exploitation as well, that is allowing, permitting, or encouraging a child to engage in prostitution. With sexual abuse, you might see inappropriate displays of affection, over-compliance, pain during urination, also frequent vomiting and wetting pants. Those are all signs to look for with sexual abuse. Emotional abuse includes non-accidental mental injury. And boys are at greater risk of serious injury and of emotional neglect than are girls. It is estimated that children with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more vulnerable to sexual abuse than their non-disabled peers. And the incidence of fatality injured girls has declined slightly with the increase of fatal injury with the boys rising. Children whose parents abuse drugs or alcohol are put at greater risk for violent victimization as well. All right, so back onto emotional abuse. Belittling, rejecting, that violent environment also is an emotional abuse. So if there's a lot of fighting going on within the home, they are subject to seeing domestic violence. There might be drug use within the home as well. Those all aid into emotional abuse. And so when we're looking at children with emotional abuse, they might have a lack of interest, lack of emotion. They might have increased emotional needs where you see that they are, when they do reach out, they're reaching out to people that might take advantage of them because they're just looking at some way to connect. Neglect means negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child, including the failure to provide adequate food, medical treatment, supervision, clothing, or shelter. And we have 3 different areas of neglect: physical, educational, and emotional. Signs to look for with neglect, again, are poor hygiene, sleepiness, lack of supervision, frequent tardiness, and absences from schools. Children's basic needs, that's what's going to go in with looking for neglect. We want to see that their basic needs aren't being met. So here's a list of basic needs that we look for and make sure that the child is having those met. Adequately, I should add. So if you suspect child abuse, what is it that we're supposed to do? You need to trust your instincts, take lots of notes, look at the facts, and then you're going to use the form to do your reporting. And this is what the form looks like, and you're going to fill it out in its entirety. Once you have reported somebody, you are acting in good faith. Therefore, you are not held liable for actions by mandated reporters. However, if you do not report, that is when your liability comes in. And again, in red, it's not necessary to prove that the abuse or neglect happened, but you must have to have a reasonable suspicion. So to go along with, are you, back on this one, are you liable? Is your job protected? Your job is protected because you are a public or private employer who discharges, suspends, disciplines, or penalizes an employee solely for reporting suspected child abuse or neglect shall be guilty of a Class C misdemeanor. So your job is protected if the only thing that you have done is reported something. There are many different ways to file a report, and here they are. In the report, you're going to include all of this information, and again, it's on that form. If you do not report, and you knew that something was happening, a punishment by a sentence of no more than 6 months or imprisonment, or a fine no more than $500 is going to be what you receive. However, you also now do have a record. So how common is child abuse and neglect? Here we've got quite a few statistics, and I also want to show you a book. Let's see, let me escape out of here real quick. This is published. This is the most recent one that's available on the website, but it is published every couple years, Child Maltreatment. This one's 2012. And it's a book, and I'll post it on Blackboard as well. And it has all of the different areas of child abuse and neglect. Like here we go, Alabama. These are the people who were screened for child abuse and neglect. So in Alabama, there were 20,599 referrals. 302 screened out that there wasn't anything to look at, leaving it with 20,901 children who got screened for child abuse or neglect. And it's very interesting because you can go in here and you can look at the child deaths and maltreatment. Here we go. You can do it by age, and then it also has it broken up by age and by the state that you're in. So a lot of really interesting information that goes along with the child maltreatment. These are some indicators that we look at for child well-being to see if a child is going to be more at risk for child abuse or neglect. This is another book I'm going to show you, but these are the things that we look at: child death rate, teen death rate, high school dropout rate, children in poverty, children in single-parent families, and low birth weight babies, in addition to some other areas. But this book, again, is done every year. Alabama Kids Count Data Book, and this is broken up by the different sections that we just went through: health, school, education, economic well-being. And going through those, you'll see, let's go to health real quick, infant mortality rate, and it's got a lot of statistics going with it so that we can really understand child abuse and neglect treatment. And so these are all based on the statewide, and then we get into our different counties throughout the state. So both interesting reads that I will post on Blackboard for you. In 2011, 37.4% of those who were child abuse and neglect in those statistics were for neglect, 50% for physical abuse, 0.5% for psychological abuse, and 21.9% for sexual abuse. Long-term effects of child abuse, obviously none of these should stand out as something that you wouldn't have realized, with suicide, brain damage, crime and violence, unemployment, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy, STDs, dropping out of school, learning disorders, or speech difficulties. All of those come into play. And the abusers for child abuse and neglect most abusers are members of a victim's family, either a caretaker or a parent or a close relative. 90% of confirmed physical abuse and neglect cases involve caretakers of children. Contrary to common belief, males and females perpetrate abuse against their own children at surprisingly similar rates. And then who are the abusers? Again, among all abused children, those abused by their birth parents were about equally likely to have been abused by mothers as by fathers. But those abused by other parents, parent substitutes, or other non-parental perpetrators were much more likely to abuse by males. So that's pretty interesting. So what does child maltreatment mean to the society? A lot of money is going into the after effects of child abuse and neglect, all the medical that goes along with it and all of that kind of things. And a child who is abused and neglected is 59% more likely to be arrested as a juvenile than any other children. And then it's that cycle that if you were abused, you become the abuser. But let's take a look with how costly it is. And we've got this quote up here. But the direct costs, those are the hospitalization bills, chronic health problems, mental health. Look at this number up here. This compared to what we have in our budget set for prevention of child abuse and neglect. So there's a lot of what we need. I mean, when you're just comparing these two numbers of direct costs and indirect costs versus where we're spending in our prevention, we need to increase that, and that is something that is constantly being worked on in this legislation. These risk factors we talked about, just like in the data count books, these are the things that we look at for somebody to be abused or to be an abuser. unemployment, substance abuse, lack of knowledge of effective parenting techniques, mental illness, their own abuse during childhood, and living at or below the poverty level are all some of the risk factors for abuse. So what we have tried to do to prevent child abuse and neglect is promote community awareness, educate parents, educate children, provide role models and dependable child care, work with community leaders, and support special programs, as well as supporting children's legal rights. All of these are things that we do for community action and prevention. These are who you would contact currently for child abuse and neglect, but I want us to take a look at a video real quick. See if I can find it. Okay.
Familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for the day races, going nowhere, going nowhere. The tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I won't drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny, find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. Find it hard to tell you, find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's very, very mad. Children wait for the day they feel good. Happy birthday, happy birthday. And feel the way that every child should. Sit and listen, sit and listen. Went to school and I was very nervous. No one knew me, no one knew me. Hello teacher, tell me what's my lesson. Looked right through me, looked right through me. Around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces. It looks like rain again today. Dark clouds gather and fill the sky. Don't know how to talk to you, just know how to say.
Okay. Let me hit pause on there real quick so it doesn't... No, I don't want to go to another one. Okay, so before I leave you, I just want to say that Children See, Children Do video the only way that we're going to prevent child abuse and neglect is by education. We need to educate the parents. We need to educate children. So you're going to take the mandated reporter online training and receive a certificate when you get through with it. And that will help you understand more about training, but it'll also show you what you can do to help just educate people. So that is it for today, and we will see you back here next week.